Chapter 6 of Book 5 of Topics by Aristotle, translated by Octavius Owen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Chapter 6 of Property from Opposites. We must next consider from opposites, first from contraries, the subverter indeed, whether the contrary is not the property of the contrary, since a contrary will not be the property of a contrary. Thus, since injustice is contrary to justice, but the worst to the best, and the best is not the property of justice, neither would the worst be the property of injustice. On the other hand, the confirmer must examine whether the contrary is the property of the contrary. For a contrary will be the property of a contrary. Thus, since evil is contrary to good, and what is to be avoided to what is eligible, but the property of good is the eligible, the property of evil would be that which is to be avoided. Next, from relatives, the subverter indeed, if one relative is not the property of another relative, for this relative will not be the property of that relative. Thus, since the double is spoken relatively to the half, and the exceeding to the exceeded, but the exceeding is not the property of the double, the exceeded would not be the property of the half. It is confirmed, however, if one relative is the property of another, for this relative will be the property of that. Thus, since the double is spoken relatively to the half, one indeed with relation to two, but 2 to 1, and the property of the double is as 2 to 1, the property of the half will be as 1 to 2. Thirdly, it is subverted if what is predicated according to habit is not the property of the habit, since neither will what is predicated according to privation be the property of privation. Also, if what is predicated as to privation is not the property of privation, neither will what is predicated as to habit be the property of habit. Thus, since privation of sense is not said to be the property of deafness, neither would sensation be the property of hearing. Again, it is confirmed if what is predicated according to habit is the property of habit, for what is predicated as to privation will be also the property of privation, and if what is predicated as to privation is the property of privation, what is predicated as to habit will be the property of habit. Thus, since it is the property of sight to see, according as we possess sight, not to see would be the property of blindness, according as we do not possess sight when we are naturally adapted to have it. Moreover, from affirmatives and negatives, and first from the predicates themselves, but this place is useful for the subverter only. Thus, if affirmation, or what is predicated as to affirmation, is the property of a thing, neither negation, nor what is predicated as to negation, will be the property of it. But if negation, or what is predicated according to negation, is its property, neither affirmation, nor what is predicated as to affirmation will be its property. Thus, since animated is the property of animal, what is not animated will not be the property of animal. Secondly, from things predicated or not predicated, and of which they are predicated or not predicated, subverting it indeed if affirmation is not the property of affirmation, for neither will negation be the property of negation, and if negation is not the property of negation, neither will affirmation be the property of affirmation. Thus, since animal is not the property of man, neither would what is not animal be the property of what is not man. And if what is not animal appears to be not the property of what is not man, neither will animal be the property of man. We confirm it, on the contrary, if affirmation is the property of affirmation, for negation will also be the property of negation, and if negation is the property of negation, affirmation also will be the property of affirmation. Thus, since not to live is the property of what is not animal, to live would be the property of animal. And if to live appears the property of animal, not to live will appear the property of what is not animal. Thirdly, from subjects themselves, subverting indeed, if the assigned property is the property of affirmation, since the same will not also be the property of negation. But if what is assigned be the property of negation, it will not be the property of affirmation. Thus, since the animated is the property of animal, the animated would not be the property of what is not animal. On the other hand, confirming it, if the assigned be not the property of affirmation, for it would be that of negation. This place, however, is false, for affirmation is not the property of negation, nor negation of affirmation, for affirmation is not wholly present with negation, but negation is with affirmation, yet is not present as a property. Next, from things oppositely divided, subverting indeed, if none of the oppositely divided is the property of no one of the remaining oppositely divided, since neither will what is stated be the property of that of which it is stated as the property. Thus, since sensible animal is the property of no other animal, intelligible animal would not be the property of God. Again, confirming it, if any one of the remainder oppositely divided is the property of each of these which are oppositely divided, for the remainder will be the property of that of which it is stated not to be the property. Thus, since it is the property of prudence to be naturally per se, the virtue of the reasoning part, and of each of the other virtues thus assumed, the property of prudence would be to be naturally per se, the virtue of the appetitive part of the soul. Chapter 7. Of property as to cases. In the next place, from cases, subverting property indeed if case is not the property of case, for neither will one case be the property of the other. Thus, since what is beautifully is not the property of what is justly, the beautiful would not be the property of the just. On the other hand, confirming if case is the property of case, for the one case will be the property of the other. Thus, since pedestrian biped is the property of man in the nominative case, it would also be the property of man to be called pedestrian biped in the dative case. Not only, however, must we observe cases in respect of what has been stated, but also in opposites, as was observed in the former places, subverting indeed if the case of the opposite is not the property of the case of the opposite, for neither will the case of one opposite be the property of the case of another opposite. Thus, since what is well done is not the property of what is justly done, neither would be ill done the property of that which is done unjustly. Again, we confirm it if the case of the opposite be the property of the case of the opposite. For the case of this opposite will be the property of the case of that opposite. Thus, since best is the property of good, worst would be the property of evil. Next, from those which subsist similarly, subverting indeed, if what subsists similarly is not the property of what has similar subsistence, for neither will what subsists similarly be the property of that which has similar subsistence. Thus, since the builder of a house subsists similarly with regard to building a house, as the physician with regard to producing health, but it is not the property of the physician to produce health, neither would it be the property of the house builder to produce a house. It is confirmed, however, if what subsists similarly is the property of what has similar subsistence, for the similarly subsisting will also be the property of what has similar subsistence. Thus, since the physician subsists similarly with regard to being effective of health, as the trainer of the gymnasium to the being effective of a good habit of body, but the being effective of a good habit of body is the property of the trainer, to be effective of health would be the property of the physician. Next, from those which subsist after the same manner, subverting indeed, if what subsists after the same manner is not the property of what subsists after the same manner. For neither will what subsists after the same manner be the property of what subsists after the same manner. But if of that which subsists after the same manner, that which subsists after the same manner is the property, it will not be the property of that thing of which it is stated to be the property. Thus, since prudence subsists after the same manner with regard to the honourable and the base, from there being a science of each of them, but to be the science of the honourable is not the property of prudence, it would not be the property of prudence to be the science of the base. But if it is the property of prudence to be the science of the honourable, it would not be the property of it to be the science of the base, since it is impossible that the same thing should be the property of many. For him who confirms, indeed, this place is of no use, for what subsists after the same manner is one thing compared with many. Next, we subvert it if what is said to exist is not the property of what is said to exist, since neither will to be corrupted be the property of that which is said to be corrupted, nor to be generated of what is said to be generated. For instance, since it is not the property of man to be animal, neither will to be generated animal be the property of to be generated man, nor will the corruption of animal be the property of the corruption of man. After the same manner we must assume the argument from being generated to existence and being corrupted, and from being corrupted to existence and being generated, as was just now said from existence to the being generated and corrupted. Again, we confirm it if of what is arranged according to existence the property is that which is arranged according to the same. For what is said to be according to the being generated will also be the property of what is said to be according to the being generated, and of what is said to be corrupted, that which is assigned according to this. Thus, since to be mortal is the property of man, to be generated mortal would also be the property of the being generated man, and the corruption of mortal of the corruption of man. In the same way, indeed, we must take the argument, both from the being generated and the being corrupted, with regard both to existence and to the same from the same, as was observed to him who subverts. Next, we must pay attention to the idea of the thing proposed, subverting indeed, if it be not present with the idea, or if not as to this, according to which that is stated, of which the property is a sign. For what is stated to be will not be the property. Thus, since rest is not present with man himself, so far as he is man, but so far as he is idea, rest would not be the property of man. We confirm it indeed, if it is present with the idea, and is present so far as it is predicated of this very thing, of which it is stated not to be the property. For what is stated not to be will be property. Thus, since it is present with animal itself, to be composed of soul and body, and this is present with it, so far as it is animal, to be composed of soul and body would be the property of animal. Chapter 8. Of property from the more and less. Next, from the more and less, first indeed subverting, if the more is not the property of the more, for neither will the less be the property of the less, nor the least of the least, nor the most of the most, nor the simply of the simply. Thus, since to be more coloured is not the property of what is more body, neither will to be less coloured be the property of what is less body, nor in short will to be coloured be the property of body. We confirm it, however, if the more is the property of the more, since the less also will be the property of the less, and the least of the least, and the most of the most, and the simply of the simply. For instance, since to perceive more is the property of what is more vital, to perceive less would be the property of the less vital, and the most of the most, the least of the least, and the simply of the simply. From the simply, too, the subverter must consider whether the simply is not the property of the simply, for neither will the more be the property of the more, nor the less of the less, nor the most of the most, nor the least of the least. Thus, since it is not the property of man to be worthy, neither would to be more worthy be the property of what is more man. The confirmer, however, must consider whether what is simply is the property of what is simply, for the more will be the property of the more, the less also of the less, the least of the least, and the most of the most. Thus, since it is the property of fire naturally to tend upwards, it would also be the property of what is more fire naturally to tend more upwards, and in the same manner we must direct attention from other things also to all these. Secondly, it is subverted if the more is not the property of the more, since neither will the less be the property of the less. Thus, since it is more the property of animal to perceive than of man to know, but it is not the property of animal to perceive, it would not be the property of man to know. We confirm it, indeed, if the less is the property of the less, for the more will also be the property of the more. Thus, since it is less the property of man to be naturally mild than of animal to live, but it is the property of man to be naturally mild, it would be the property of animal to live. Thirdly, we subvert it if it is not the property of which it is more the property, since neither will it be the property of that of which it is less the property, but if it is the property of that, it will not be the property of this. Thus, since to be coloured is more the property of superficies than of body, but it is not the property of superficies, neither would to be coloured be the property of body. If, however, it is the property of superficies, it would not be the property of body. This place, indeed, is not useful to the confirmer, since it is impossible that the same thing should be the property of many. Fourthly, it is subverted if what is more the property of the thing is not its property, since neither will what is less its property be the property, e.g., since the sensible is more the property of animal than the partible, but the sensible is not the property of animal, the partible would not be the property of animal. But it is confirmed if what is less its property is the property of it, since what is more its property will be the property. Thus, since it is less the property of animal to perceive than to live, but to perceive is the property of animal, to live would be the property of animal. Next, from things which exist similarly, first indeed subverting, if what is similarly the property is not the property of that of which it is similarly the property, since neither will what is similarly property be the property of this of which it is similarly the property. Thus, since it is similarly the property of the appetitive part of the soul to desire, and of the reasoning part to reason, but to desire is not the property of the appetitive part, neither would to reason be the property of the reasoning part. On the other hand, we confirm it, if what is similarly property is the property of this of which it is similarly the property, for what is similarly property will be the property of this thing of which it is similarly the property. For instance, since what is primarily prudent is similarly the property of the reasoning part, and what is primarily temperate of the appetitive part, but what is primarily prudent is the property of the reasoning, the primarily temperate would be the property of the appetitive part. Secondly, we subvert it if what is similarly the property of a thing is not its property, since neither will what is similarly property be the property of it. Thus, since it is similarly the property of man to see and to hear, but to see is not the property of man, neither would the property of man be to hear. Again, we confirm it, if what is similarly the property of a thing is its property, for what is similarly its property will be the property. Thus, since it is similarly the property of the soul that a part of it should be appetitive primarily and argumentative, but it is the property of the soul that a part of it is primarily appetitive, it would be the property of the soul that a part of it is primarily argumentative. Thirdly, it is subverted if it is not the property of what it is similarly the property, since neither will it be the property of what it is similarly the property, but if it is the property of that, it will not be the property of the other. Thus, since to burn is similarly the property of flame and of a burning coal, but it is not the property of flame to burn, neither would it be the property of a burning coal to burn. But if it is the property of flame, it would not be the property of a burning coal. This place, however, is of no use to him who confirms. Nevertheless, the place from things similarly affected differs from that from things similarly inherent, because the one is assumed according to analogy, and is not considered in respect of something being inherent, but the other is compared from something being inherent. Chapter 9. Topics upon property as to capacity, etc. Next, property is subverted indeed, if he who assigns it in capacity assigns also that property in capacity to that which is not, capacity being by no possibility present with a non-entity, for what is laid down to be will not be property. Thus, since he who says the property of air is that which may be breathed, assigns property in capacity, for a property of this kind is that which is capable of being breathed, but also assigns the property to that which is not, for although an animal should not exist, which is naturally capable of breathing the air, yet the air may exist, though if animal is not, it is not possible to breathe. Hence a thing of such a kind as that it may be breathed will not then be the property of air, when there will not be such an animal as can breathe. Wherefore, what may be breathed would not be the property of air. Again, we confirm it, if he who assigns it in capacity either assigns the property to that which is, or to that which is not, when capacity may be present with what is not, since what is stated not to be property will be property. Thus, since he who assigns as the property of being the ability to suffer or to act, assigning property in capacity, has assigned property to being, for when being is, it will also be able to suffer, or to do something, hence ability to suffer or to act would be the property of being. Next, it is subverted if it is placed in hyperbole, since what is laid down to be will not be property, for it happens to those who thus assign property that the name is not verified in respect of what the sentence is verified, since the thing being corrupted, the sentence will nevertheless remain, for it will especially be present with something existing. Thus, if some one should assign the property of fire to be the lightest body, for when fire is corrupted, there will be a certain body, which will be the lightest, so that the lightest body would not be the property of fire. It is confirmed, however, if the property is not placed in hyperbole, for as to this the property will be well stated, e.g., since he who states the property of man to be an animal naturally mild, does not assign property in hyperbole, so far as regards this, the property would be well stated. End of chapter 9 and end of book 5. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.